Think you could build a cabin from scratch? Just you, an axe, and the wilderness? In the 1800s, when people actually had to do this to survive, the failure rate was catastrophic. 30 to 40% of homesteaders abandoned their claims within the first year. The number one reason: they couldn't build a shelter that would keep them alive through winter. Building a cabin wasn't like modern construction, where you call a contractor and have a house in 3 months. This was one person, maybe a family, with hand tools, no hardware store, no tutorials, and no margin for error. You needed skills modern people don't have: felling trees without killing yourself, hewing logs square, notching corners that wouldn't collapse, chinking gaps that wouldn't let in deadly cold. Get any of these wrong and your shelter would fail. Shelter failure meant death. Abandoned homestead claims dot the frontier landscape. Empty, collapsed cabins that represent families who tried and couldn't succeed. Some died in the attempt. Others fled before winter killed them. Over the next 17 minutes, we're going through every step of frontier cabin construction, what it actually took, where people failed, and why even experienced builders said this was one of the hardest things they ever did. You need logs. That seems obvious. But choosing the wrong trees would doom your cabin before you even started building. Most people chose wrong. Not all trees work for cabin building. You need straight-grained wood that wouldn't split, wood that wouldn't rot quickly, trees large enough to span your cabin width, trees close enough to your building site to actually move them. Ideal cabin logs measured 8 to 12 inches in diameter and 12 to 16 feet long, from species like pine, spruce, or cedar. You needed 40 to 60 of these logs, and they all had to be relatively similar in size. Finding that many perfect trees within workable distance of your building site, many homesteaders couldn't. Trees near rivers flooded in spring. Trees on hillsides were hard to move downhill. Trees in dense forest required clearing just to access. Trees in open areas were often gnarled and unusable. Historical records show homesteaders building cabins from inadequate timber. Too thin, too crooked, mixed species that aged differently, logs from diseased trees. These cabins failed within years, sometimes months. Experienced loggers could spot good timber. City people moving west? They'd choose based on convenience, not quality. One Wyoming homesteader wrote in his diary about selecting trees too close to a creek bed. The first spring flood destroyed his entire log supply before he even started building. Just finding and marking your trees could take days or weeks. You're walking through potentially miles of forest, evaluating hundreds of trees, marking the best ones. Today you order lumber, cut to exact specifications, dried, treated, delivered. Frontier builders had to become expert foresters before swinging a single axe. Trees chosen. Now you have to cut them down. This is where people started dying. Your primary tool, a felling axe weighing 4 to 6 pounds. You'll swing this thousands of times per tree. Arm strength, accuracy, and endurance all matter. Modern people using a computer keyboard 8 hours a day, not prepared. Proper felling requires correct undercut angle, understanding wood grain, predicting fall direction, escape route planning, awareness of widowmakers, hanging branches, recognition of tension and compression in bent trees. Trees fall wrong and crush you. Axes glance off and hit your leg. Saw binding traps your tool. Limbs break off during fall and kill you. Trees hit other trees and create hung trees that can fall unexpectedly later. 20% of logging accidents in the 1800s resulted in serious injury or death. Frontier doctors' records document countless axe wounds, crushed limbs, and deaths from falling trees. One Minnesota doctor's Chirigor No records 14 logging deaths in 18 months in a small area. Felling a single 12-inch diameter tree with an axe took 3 to 5 hours of continuous swinging. You need 50 trees. That's 150 to 250 hours of some of the most physically demanding labor possible. Professional loggers today use chainsaws, heavy equipment, and safety gear. Frontier homesteaders had an axe, determination, and prayer. Tree down. Now you need to move it. A single 16-foot log can weigh 300 to 500 pounds. You need 50 of them. One person cannot move a 400-pound log any meaningful distance. Physics won't allow it. This reveals the first big frontier lie. The self-reliant individual pioneer couldn't actually build a cabin alone. You needed draft animals like horses or oxen, logging chains or ropes, leverage tools like cant hooks and peavies, additional people for lifting and positioning. Most homesteaders had none of this initially. Some tried dragging logs with improvised rope. Ropes broke, logs got stuck, injuries resulted. Some tried rolling logs. Down hills, they couldn't stop. On flat ground, they couldn't move far. Some gave up and built tiny cabins from logs they could move. Then froze when these inadequate shelters failed. Successful cabin building required community help. Cabin raisings weren't fun social events. They were survival necessity. But isolated homesteaders, distant from neighbors, or people who'd alienated their community, they failed at the stage. All of this, finding trees, felling them, moving them, had to happen before winter. Start too late in the season, and you'd run out of time. Montana territorial records document multiple families caught by early October snowstorms, with only partial log supplies. 3 of those families didn't survive the winter. Let's say you succeeded. You found good trees, felled them without dying, and got them to your building site. You've completed maybe 10% of the work. Now comes the part that broke most people: preparing the logs. You can't just stack round logs on top of each other and call it a cabin. Well, you can, but it won't keep you alive. The logs need to be prepared. This is where most people discovered they lacked essential skills. Tree bark harbors insects, holds moisture, and rots. It has to come off, all of it, from every log. Using a draw knife or spud, you'd strip bark from 12 to 16 feet of log surface per tree. Multiply by 50 trees. That's 600 to 800 linear feet of bark removal. Blisters, splinters, repetitive strain injuries. Bark removal is easier when sap is running in spring and early summer. But if you're felling trees in spring, the logs need to dry before building, which takes 3 to 4 months. Build with wet logs and your cabin will twist, warp, and crack as it dries, creating gaps that let in cold and rain. Impatient builders used wet logs. First winter, their cabins twisted apart. One Nebraska homesteader's cabin literally pulled itself to pieces as green logs dried and shrank. The family survived, but had to rebuild from scratch the following year. While logs dry, they need to be elevated off the ground, or they rot from moisture, protected from rain, but exposed to air. You need to build a storage structure before you build your cabin. For better quality cabins, at least 2 sides of each log needed to be flat. This required a skill called hewing. This is where modern people would utterly fail. Hewing, using a broadaxe to flatten a round log to a uniform thickness. Sounds simple. It's not. This requires understanding wood grain, perfect axe control, consistent angle maintenance, tremendous upper body strength, and hours of practice. A skilled hewer could produce a flat surface in 3 to 4 hours per log. A novice might take days produce an unusable surface, or injure themselves trying. One Kansas homesteader's diary entry reads, "Tried hewing today, ruined 2 logs, nearly took my foot off. Going back to round logs and hoping for the best. Broadaxes are massive, sharp, and swung with full force parallel to your legs. One slip and you've severed an artery." Frontier medical records document countless hewing injuries. Some fatal, most disabling. Many gave up on hewing and built with round logs. This created large gaps between logs that were nearly impossible to seal properly. These cabins were drafty, cold, and marginally effective. Today you buy dimensional lumber, milled to exact specifications. Frontier builders had to create flat surfaces with an axe, by hand, 50 times, without error. Hewing destroyed shoulders, elbows, and backs. The repetitive motion, heavy tool, and awkward angles caused injuries that we'd now recognize as severe repetitive strain. Many builders developed permanent disabilities from this work alone. Logs prepared, now you need to join them at corners. This requires cutting notches. Get this wrong, and your entire cabin will collapse. Different notch styles existed: saddle notch, dovetail notch, square notch. Each requires precise cutting. The notch must lock logs together, shed water, compress evenly as logs settle, and prevent twisting. Notches had to be nearly identical on both ends of each log, cut to the same depth, angled correctly. One bad notch in your entire cabin could cause structural failure. Poor notching caused corners separating, gaps letting in weather, uneven settling where the cabin twists, or complete structural collapse. A South Dakota homestead cabin collapsed during a spring rainstorm because of failed corner notches. The family was inside. 2 children died. This skill took years to master. Homesteaders building their first cabin had to learn on the cabin they'd live in. Mistakes weren't just aesthetic, they were life-threatening. Logs prepared, notches cut. Now you actually build the cabin. This is where the physical impossibility becomes clear. Most people needed help or failed entirely. You can't just stack logs on dirt. Moisture from ground will rot the bottom logs within months. You need a foundation. Stone foundation requires finding, moving, and stacking hundreds of pounds of stone. Log foundation requires additional logs buried partway in ground, which will rot eventually. Pier system is most durable, but requires precision placement. Ground must be leveled. Stones must be positioned level with each other. This requires tools like levels and measuring devices most homesteaders didn't have. Many eyeballed it, then lived in sloped cabins. Inadequate foundations caused rotting sill logs, sloped floors, structural instability, and water infiltration. Repairing a foundation requires dismantling the cabin. One Oregon family had to completely disassemble and rebuild their cabin after 2 years because the foundation stones had settled unevenly and the entire structure was collapsing. Foundation set. Now you start stacking logs. Each one heavier than the last as you go higher. First logs lift to waist height, manageable with help. 4th row lifts to chest height, difficult. 8th row lifts to above head height, nearly impossible. Final roof logs lift to 10 or 11 feet, absolutely impossible for 2 people. You needed multiple strong adults, leverage systems like ramps and pulleys, coordination and communication, and good luck. A single dropped log could kill someone. This is why cabin raisings existed. You couldn't build alone. The mythology of the solitary pioneer building their own cabin? Largely false. You needed 10 to 15 people for the heavy lifting. Homesteaders far from neighbors or those who couldn't get help often built much smaller cabins, which meant less living space and inadequate shelter, or they attempted it with too few people and got injured. Historical records show crushed hands and feet from dropped logs, back injuries from improper lifting, people pinned under fallen logs. An Iowa frontier doctor treated 6 separate crushing injuries in one summer, all from cabin building accidents. 3 of those men never regained full use of their hands. A cabin raising had to be completed in 1 to 2 days while you had help. That meant exhausting, dangerous work with no breaks. Injuries increased as the day went on and fatigue set in. Walls up, now comes the most dangerous part: the roof. You needed ridge poles, roof rafters, roof boards or bark, and waterproofing material. All of this had to be constructed while working at height with no safety equipment. Working 10 to 12 feet in the air, on slippery logs, carrying heavy materials, using sharp tools. Falls were common and often fatal. 15% of frontier construction deaths came from falls during roof work. Roof pitch matters. Too flat, and snow loads collapse it, water doesn't drain. Too steep, and it's unstable. Many homesteaders had no carpentry experience and built inadequate roofs. Roof failures came from inadequate support structure, poor waterproofing, snow load collapse, or improper pitch. One Montana homesteader's cabin roof collapsed under 3 feet of snow in January. He was trapped inside for 2 days before neighbors found him. He survived but lost 4 toes to frostbite. Making a roof actually waterproof required wood shakes, hand-split shingles, bark layer, or sod. Each had challenges. Poor waterproofing meant living under a constant leak. Even well-built roofs required constant maintenance. Shakes rotted and needed replacing. Bark layers degraded. Sod grew heavy with water and collapsed. A roof was never truly finished. Walls up, roof on, you'd think you're done. You're not even close. A cabin with walls and a roof will still kill you if the finishing work isn't done right. This is where exhausted, desperate builders made fatal mistakes. Gaps between logs let in wind, rain, snow, insects, and rodents. These gaps needed to be sealed. This process, chinking, was never truly finished. Chinking mixture used mud, clay, moss, straw, animal hair, whatever was available. This had to be packed into every gap. If you calculate the total linear feet of gaps in a typical cabin, you're looking at over 1,000 feet of chinking work. Pack chinking between logs, smooth it, hope it stays. It didn't. Chinking cracked when it dried, fell out when logs settled, washed away in rain, was picked out by birds for nesting material. Chinking required constant maintenance. Every spring, homesteaders would spend weeks re-chinking their cabins. Miss this, and you'd freeze next winter. Inadequate chinking caused heat loss where fuel consumption tripled, illness from drafts, water infiltration leading to rot, and insect and rodent invasion. A Wisconsin family nearly froze to death when their poorly chinked cabin let in sub-zero air all winter. The father's journal entry from February described ice forming on the inside walls and waking to find snow drifted onto their beds. You need a door. You need at least one window. Cutting openings in your log walls weakens the structure. Every opening interrupts the locking pattern of logs. Without proper support, walls could sag or collapse. You needed carefully placed logs above openings, proper framing, and reinforcement. Making a door required flat boards, which you had to make, hinges from expensive metal, and a latching mechanism. Many early cabins had only blankets or hides covering doorways, inadequate for winter. Glass was expensive and fragile. Most frontier cabins had shuttered windows with no glass. This meant no light when closed for protection, no warmth when opened for light. You chose C, or stay warm. Not both. Many cabins had dirt floors initially. Making a wood floor required additional lumber, time, and skill. Dirt floors meant dust, mud, moisture, impossible to keep clean. You needed heat and cooking capability. Options included stone fireplaces, best but requiring significant masonry skill, mud chimneys, common but a fire hazard, or open fire pits with roof holes and poor ventilation. Improperly built fireplaces caused cabin fires. 20 to 30% of frontier cabins burned down, many from chimney or fireplace failures. One Colorado mining camp lost 11 cabins in one winter to fireplace-related fires. Stone fireplace construction required gathering stones, making mortar, understanding chimney draft, and proper flashing. Most homesteaders had never done masonry. Many fireplaces smoked constantly or drew poorly, making the cabin barely livable. We've covered the process. Now let's talk about time, because the calendar was actively trying to kill you. If you arrived in spring, you had maybe 6 to 7 months before winter. Sounds like plenty. It wasn't. Time required, finding trees took 2 to 4 weeks. Felling and moving logs took 4 to 6 weeks. Preparing logs took 6 to 8 weeks. Building the cabin took 2 to 4 weeks. Finishing work took 4 to 6 weeks. Total, 18 to 28 weeks minimum. That's assuming nothing goes wrong, no injuries, perfect weather, and sufficient help available. Things went wrong constantly. Injuries slowed progress. Rain stopped work. Help wasn't available when needed. Most homesteaders were behind schedule from day one. Rushed work meant skipped steps, poor quality, dangerous shortcuts, and inadequate preparation. Many cabins were unfinished when winter arrived. First snow could come in October in northern territories, earlier in mountains. If your cabin wasn't done, you faced winter in an incomplete shelter. Many died. One North Dakota territorial survey from 1873 documented 42 abandoned homesteads in a single county. Follow-up investigations found evidence that at least 8 of those families had died on their claims, most from exposure and inadequate shelters during their first winter. Building the cabin wasn't your only job. While building your cabin, you also needed to clear land for planting, plant crops for food, hunt for food, preserve food for winter, gather massive amounts of firewood, haul water, and care for animals if you had any. Every hour spent on the cabin was an hour not spent on food production. But without the cabin, you'd freeze. Without food, you'd starve. There weren't enough hours. Homesteaders worked 14 to 16-hour days, 7 days a week, for months. Exhaustion led to mistakes, injuries, and poor decision-making. One Wyoming homesteader fell asleep while felling a tree. The tree fell wrong and killed him. His family abandoned the claim 3 weeks later. Winter arrived, cabin incomplete, food stores inadequate, firewood insufficient. This is when families abandoned claims and fled if they could reach a town before being snowed in. 30 to 40% of homestead claims were abandoned in the first year. Primary reasons: inadequate shelter, insufficient supplies, failure to complete necessary work in time. Those who stayed in incomplete cabins faced horrific conditions. A Montana doctor's records from the winter of 1882 described treating 7 cases of severe frostbite, 3 amputations, and 2 deaths, all from families living in inadequately finished cabins. We've seen what success required. Now let's be clear about why failure was so common. These weren't lazy or incompetent people. The task was near impossible. Many homesteaders came from cities or towns. They never felled a tree, hewn a log, notched corners, or built anything with hand tools. They were shopkeepers, clerks, laborers, not carpenters. You can't learn carpentry, logging, and stonemasonry in a few months while also building your survival shelter. The skill requirements exceeded most people's ability to learn quickly enough. Isolated homesteads meant no experienced builders nearby to learn from. Books existed but didn't replace hands-on instruction. You learned by failing. Failure meant death. Quality tools were expensive. Many homesteaders arrived with one poor quality axe, a saw, and basic hand tools. You needed multiple axes, saws, chisels, augers, adzes, hammers, levels, and squares. Tools costing more than most had. Without horses or oxen, moving logs was nearly impossible. But animals required upfront purchase cost, food, care, harnesses, and knowledge of how to work them. Many couldn't afford animals. No community help meant no cabin raising, no shared tools, no collective knowledge, and no emergency assistance. Distance killed. This work exceeded human physical capacity for most people. Modern people, even fit ones, aren't conditioned for 16-hour days of manual labor, swinging axes for hours, lifting hundreds of pounds repeatedly, no rest days, and no medical care when injured. Minor injuries became major setbacks. A sprained back meant weeks unable to work, weeks you didn't have. Axe wounds got infected. Falls caused permanent disabilities. Frontier mortality rates for working-age men during homesteading years were 3 times higher than eastern cities. Some people did succeed. Let's be clear about what made the difference. It wasn't just determination. It was specific advantages. Successful cabin builders typically had previous building experience, family or community, help, sufficient tools and resources, arrived early in the season, good health and strength, nearby timber, and some financial resources for supplies. Those who succeeded often built smaller, simpler cabins initially. They didn't aim for perfection. They aimed for survival. Improvements came later, over years. Participation in mutual aid networks was crucial. You helped neighbors build. They helped you. Isolated individualists mostly failed. Many successful builders had actually failed before. First cabin collapsed. They learned, built better second one. But that required surviving the first failure. A finished cabin required annual chinking repair, roof maintenance, replacement of rotted logs, fireplace repair, floor improvements, and enlargements as family grew. Frontier cabins were never truly finished. They were ongoing construction projects. Many successful frontier cabins were torn down and replaced within 10 to 20 years. The first cabin was a survival shelter, not a permanent home. Back to the original question, could you build a cabin from scratch? Let's be honest about the answer. Modern people lack axework skills, log preparation knowledge, structural engineering understanding, physical conditioning, tool-making ability, weather reading, timber selection expertise, and notching precision. Watching videos about cabin building isn't the same as swinging an axe 8 hours a day for weeks. The physical reality and skill development required can't be learned from screens. Modern people depend on chainsaws, power drills, nail guns, levels, pre-milled lumber, hardware stores, and professional help. Remove all of that, and most couldn't build a doghouse, let alone a cabin. Could you build a frontier cabin from scratch? Honestly, probably not. That's not an insult. It's just reality. The 30 to 40% failure rate wasn't because people were weak or stupid. It was because the task was nearly impossible. With the resources and knowledge available, the ones who succeeded did something remarkable. The ones who failed and survived, they were smart enough to know when to quit before the wilderness killed them. What part of this process do you think you'd fail at first? My money's on the log notching, or possibly dying when the first tree falls. Don't forget to leave a like and a subscribe if you wish to help my channel grow. Thank you.